email or multiple emails from Alessandro in the coming week about that. So we won't be here. I guess you can bring your laptop and sit here and watch it virtually, but just for next week we'll be virtual. Otherwise, I'm going to turn over to Jimmy and let you introduce our speaker today. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vida. So from NSF-NCAR. So Dr. Vida received his PhD in the ecology and evolution biology from the University of Colorado. And his research has been most focused on understanding of soil biogeochemistry, carbon cycling, and land-climate interactions. Beyond his research, he also plays a major service role in the CESM community as a co-chair of the CESM Land Model working group, and also through his contribution to this CESM tutorial and educational training experience for the broader community, including many universities in the States. And we are now very glad to have him here today, and we look forward to his seminar.
Great. Thanks. I feel like I'm hiding down there. Yeah, it's great to come to Madison. I think I got to come here a few years ago for an LTER conference, and we were down at the lake, like looking at bugs and stuff in the water most of the time, which is so it's fun to be up on the the top of the building looking down at Madison. When I was asked to give a title for the talk, it was like the week that NCAR was told we were going to get shut down. So I thought I should say yes to the invitation, and then also come to plead for you to come to NCAR, because it's one thing to write letters and support the National Center for Atmospheric Research, but it's something else to get to come work with us. So I'd encourage you to take that opportunity. And I don't have graduate students of my own, and so I feel like I get to be a grandparent when you guys come visit. It's fun to interact with graduate students and spoil them, and then send them home to their advisors to deal with. Okay, so what does CESM do? I'm going to start by showing you a movie. Hopefully it plays. This is atmospheric. Oh, you're not seeing it. No, how do I do this? Go here. There we go. No, wrong one. There it goes. Okay, so this is atmospheric CO2 that's being simulated globally. The simulation started in 1850, and this run ran through 2015. And all that we're giving the model here is the emissions of CO2 that are coming from anthropogenic sources. So you can see the big red dots that fire up. That's usually in the wintertime, heating emissions coming from Europe, North America, and Asia. You can also see biomass burning that's happening across savanna regions in Africa. And I kind of like watching this just because it's sort of soothing to see the colors flash across your eyes. But this pin is at Niwot Ridge, which is a long-term ecological research site that I work at, and it's also the second longest NOAA CO2 record behind the Mauna Loa Observatory. So we have places like Mauna Loa and Niwot Ridge where we've sampled CO2 in the atmosphere, and what I'm doing here in the graph is showing the evolution of CO2 sampled at Niwot Ridge in the model. And I don't have comparison to OBS on here, but we started this simulation in 1850, about 15 ppm high, and that bias kind of persisted throughout the historical period. So we started with the wrong bias, but then we kind of got the trend in the 20th century, right, which is pretty exciting. And what's harder to see is that you can watch this line go up and down, and you can also see the colors get lighter. I'll rewind it so you can watch it again. Going from more blue to more red, and this is the imprint of the biosphere breathing. So you can see kind of the land surface inhaling in the summer. The line goes down, and that's when the northern hemisphere, it's summer, so plants are photosynthesizing, and then in the winter, photosynthesis shuts down, but respiration keeps going, and so then the colors get warmer, and the line starts going up. To me, this is kind of the greatest test of the model because we know how CO2 has evolved given anthropogenic emissions throughout the 20th century. And we can test the model to see if it gets the same answer in kind of first order, see if we're getting aspects of the carbon cycle right, which is really dependent on the way we simulate land processes as well as the physics of the ocean and ocean uptake. So we're going to be doing simulations like this for CMIP 6, and I should say, this is a CMIP-6 era model. We've been doing simulations like this since really the early 2000s. But for CMIP-7, which is, we're starting those simulations hopefully starting this summer, all of the runs are going to be emissions driven. So like this run, they'll have prognostic CO2 as a feature of the model, both for the historical period where we've measured CO2 and then into the future in these different scenarios. And so we can see, let me go back to presenter mode here. So what does that do? Here's a similar trend for temperature. And so this is it's from the CESM2 large ensemble. So a large ensemble of models means that you run the same model, here CESM2 or the Community Earth System Model version 2, and we ran it 100 times. And so when you run a model 100 times, you get 100 different answers because they have slightly different initial conditions and then trajectories out into the future. So this is a 10-member ensemble. So 10 of those members, and we averaged the change. I shouldn't say we, this is actually students from Sanjeev Kumar's class. He just sent me this plot like a week or two ago. Because we started the simulation in 1850, we ran historical through 2015, but last I checked it was 2026, so we've actually have 10 years of like new data that the model's never seen before. And the ensemble mean, which is in red, and then observations from NASA GISS, which are in black, are almost indistinguishable throughout most of the historical period, and even in this last part where they're kind of fresh model runs. Our projections from the model are looking pretty good. Not good from a global temperature standpoint, but good from the model is matching observations. So between these changes in atmospheric CO2 and then the imprint that leaves on global temperatures, at least at first order, we feel like CESM is a skillful model to answer these kind of global scale predictions. My focus is on land though, and I think the questions for land modeling are pretty straightforward. They basically come down to, given these climate change trajectories, can we keep growing enough food? Will we have enough water? Will our ecosystems function in ways that can keep storing carbon for us? And then will we live in habitable cities? And so these are all components that are in CLM, or the Community Land Model. So we have a prognostic prognostic crop model that allows us to look at irrigation and nitrogen effects and management effects on land atmosphere exchanges, as well as crop production and yield. We have a pretty sophisticated snow and soil hydrology model that provides runoff to look at water resources. We're increasingly producing ecosystem scale models to look at carbon fluxes, and then we even have an urban environment. And the kind of two, I think, distinguishing features of CESM are we were the only CMIP class model to have both crop and urban models in in CMIP-6, and in CMIP-7, I think we're still likely to have the only urban model, which is kind of unique. And all of these are sort of developed at NCAR, but really improved on by collaborations with university students and faculty really across the board. So I just want to highlight that these university contributions are really important. Okay, maybe you've seen headlines like this. I don't know what your winter was like here. It sounds like it was warm and cold. In the West, it's been really, really dry, like historically dry. And so this is spring break. We thought we'd go skiing, and it was a little sad. So I can vouch for this kind of like historically low snowpack across the West. This is what it looks like from USDA forecasts. These dots are all stations, snowtel stations, where they measure snowpack accumulation over the winter and then melt. And it's all red because there's just no snow left. Like absolutely no snow. And so fears of drought and fire are real. They're already limiting water usage across big swaths of the West. And I think fire season's going to be rough. Okay, so kind of given that, I thought it would be appropriate to talk about some changes in snow and ecosystem function. This is work that I led a couple of years ago. It's, I think, the only paper that I've never mentioned carbon in, so I thought it'd be appropriate for an atmospheric science department to talk about something other than carbon. And then I want to also highlight some work that a postdoc that I've been working with did looking at potential vegetation responses to climate change. Okay, how do we get there? I mentioned it a few times, but this is just a quick overview of CESM, which is the Community Earth System Model. We have all of these components, so I'm in charge of and like thinking about the land more than anything else. But we also have a river model and a few different flavors of river models. There's an ocean model that's coupled to a wave model as well as a biogeochemistry model. We have prognostic sea ice, and kind of one of the interesting things about CESM3 is that the waves from the ocean impact the sea ice in ways that affect sea ice distribution and flow size in kind of some cool ways. We have a land ice model, and for CESM3 we'll have a prognostic Greenland ice sheet, and it's coupled to an ocean model that actually will allow for sea level rise. So this will be the first time, at least in the CESM ecosystem, we'll be able to have melting glaciers on Greenland affect sea level rise. And then KM is kind of the workhorse, it's the atmosphere model. It's coupled to a chemistry component as well as a high top component, which is called WACM. So this is kind of the whole ecosystem of CESM, and I'm happy to talk about any of these components in more detail. And when you zoom into the land model, we do a lot. There's too much happening on the screen to talk about in the time we have here. But basically, it's kind of, I think of it as being categorized into kind of the biogeophysical effects, so the surface heat fluxes and hydrology, and then the biogeochemistry that overlays that, which is kind of more focused on these buckets of carbon that move around in ecosystems through leaves, roots, and soils. Okay, snow. If you haven't thought about snow in a long time, or don't think about how snow is measured, I want to just kind of briefly go through, at least in the West, the way that we think about snow. And this is not modeled now, but observations of the SNOTEL site, which is, so SNOTEL is this network of sites where they basically have pillows on the forest floor with a pressure transducer underneath it that measures the weight of the snowpack that's accumulated on top of it. So it's a relatively simple device that captures, it's really important for capturing snow, and it's usually reported in snow water equivalent, so the pressure transducer only knows how much weight is on top of it, and so it gives you and water's relatively easy to measure in that sense, so it gives you an idea of how much water has accumulated on the pillow over time. And so what's shown in the pretty backwards rainbow is the max, median, and min snow measurements that have been taken. This is at Copper Mountain, a place that many of you might have skied, or some of you might have skied, from 1991 through 2022. So at least in my mind, that's like what I remember skiing. It's like that period of my life. Okay, so that's an average snow year, or a glimpse of what an average snow year looks like at Copper, and this is 2026. That picture that I took with skis with no snow below them was at the peak here, and it got really hot and has stayed that way ever since, and the snow has just melted away. So it was a historically low snowpack year. It's gotten even worse because of this heat wave that we've been in. Okay, there's a few things that I think are fairly obvious here, but everything about this rainbow is wide, which just tells you that there's a lot of variability. So there's large variability in a few of these features, and I want to talk about what some of those features are. One of those is just the peak SWE, so the total amount of SWE, or snow water equivalent, is basically what can then run off in the spring. And so there's a 5-fold difference at this site in the amount of peak SWE that's accumulated. And then the other thing that's important is the timing of melt. So both when that peak SWE occurs and then when it melts. And so you can see there's about a 2-month window for when the snow-free period starts at this site. And why does that matter? Because as soon as the snow melt, then plants green up and summer starts effectively. It's like there's snow melt season and then there's summer in most of these systems. And so as soon as the snow melts, the aspens start leafing out and summer started. So another important metric here is the number of snow-free days, which is just the period from when the snow melts to then when it starts accumulating again in the fall. But it's really the early side of that matters. And then the last one is winter melt. And so this is kind of a cartoony drawing that I added of what a typical snow year might look like. And so you might accumulate snow throughout the winter, but then if you get one of these heat spells, it'll melt and then start accumulating again. And so that, what I'm calling the fraction of winter melt, is just the amount of snow that melts before peak SWE. And some work that collaborators on this project have identified this fraction of winter melt as being an important metric that kind of leads in the predictability of when we might see changes in snowpack. Okay, So I sort of tipped my hand as to what the question is here. What changes could we expect in both the mean state and the variability of snow accumulation and melt? The mean state's important, but it's also that change in variability and detecting a change in the mean state given the variability that we see in the system is important. And so the study, we did this study globally, but I'm kind of going to focus here on a single grid cell in the model, which happens to be around Aspen and Crested Butte. I can't believe this is like a real picture, but it is. And so this is kind of the ecosystem, the real ecosystem that we're trying to use the model to represent. I say the real ecosystem because grid cells in CESM are relatively coarse. They're roughly 1 by 1 degree, so roughly 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. So this is a grid cell in Aspen, or near Aspen, that we focused on, and then another one in southern Idaho. I'm mostly going to focus on results from the Aspen one here. And so what I use, though, is the CESM2 large ensemble. So this is the same ensemble of models where we ran the model 100 times, got 100 different answers, and that gives you some statistics to look at the output and the change over time. I subset the data to only look at grid cells that had more than 30 millimeters of SWE, which isn't very much, but 30 millimeters of SWE for at least 3 consecutive months. And so some other features pop out, like the Sierra aren't resolved here. So it tells you something about the coarseness of the resolution of the model is that the Sierras get a ton of water, but in our version of the model they don't because the resolution is too coarse. So that's kind of a caveat to all of this, and part of the reason that I'm focusing on these snowier regions, both in the northern and the southern Rockies. And then I wanted to focus on these same metrics that we see in real SNOTEL records. And so the CSM2 large ensemble is unique because it output a lot of daily data, so we needed daily data to do an analysis like this. But you can imagine looking at data from 1850 to 2100, 100 ensemble members, and daily output. There's a lot of data to try to chew through. And to do that spatially, it's a multi-dimensional problem that I can't wrap my head around. And so I wanted to isolate for every year, from every ensemble member, from every grid cell, just metrics that I could use to reduce some of that dimensionality. So the 3 that I picked here are max SWE, or max snowwater equivalent, basically how big is the bucket that accumulates in the winter, the number of snow-free days, so that's the period from when snow melts to when it starts accumulating again, and then the fraction of winter melt, which is again those little dips down during the winter. And so now these are model results, and they go in the color bar from 1850 through 2100. This is the ensemble mean, so it's the average of 40 different ensemble members, and the daily SWE or snow water equivalent over the days of the water year. So water years start in October, and then finish at the end of September. So this is basically from October 1st through the winter, and then to melt what the snowpack in CESM looks like, which seems pretty reasonable. But I wanted to look at peak SWE, and so from SNOTEL sites that had peak SWE that was close to the ensemble average, I grabbed all of those data, all of the SNOTEL sites from the Southern Rockies, and plotted those. So each point is a SNOTEL site for a year, and you can see that the baseline, which is the black line, is kind of centered or close to the average of the observations. So but that was by design. I picked these SNOTEL sites because they were close to the average. And then what's shown in the blue and the orange are the ensemble mean plus or minus 2 standard deviations and the running mean, so just a 10-year average of that blue line. And again, you can see that the blue shading sort of captures the interannual variability of the SNOTEL sites. So the model, we pick the observations to match the model mean, but then the model standard deviation is kind of approximating what the observations are showing. And then oftentimes what's done in these types of studies is you want to try to identify the time of emergence, which is to say, when is the force change from, in this case from climate change, statistically different from the background noise? So when does the signal emerge from the noise? And so we identified that as the point where the 10-year running mean, the standard deviation of the 10 years running mean was outside of the baseline period. And so for this grid cell, at this, for this grid cell, it was in 2032 is when you would detect a change in peak SWE that you can distinguish from the noise in the model. There's a lot to run through in that graph. At the top axis then is the degrees of warming that have happened since 1850. And so many of the CMIP6 models, including CESM, were criticized for being hot models. And so this time of emergence, which historically has been used to determine when the signal emerges from the noise, now another way of thinking that is the temperature of emergence. So it takes about 1.5 degrees of global temperature change at this grid cell to see a statistical change in snowpack relative to the historical baseline. So it's not good. If you're a skier and you like skiing around Aspen, you should go make your plans for next year because it's not going to get any better. That's what I can say from this. But I wanted to look at some other metrics too. So same panels on the top, but now looking at the number of snow-free days and the fraction of winter melt. And you can see that there's less noise, there's less internal variability around the number of snow-free days. And so that time of emergence happens sooner. And so here, we've already crossed the time of emergence. And by the end of the century, it's something like 45 days. Summer's 45 days longer at this grid cell than it was during the historical period. And then the fraction of winter melt is really ramping up. So that's to say, historically in the West, we think about, snow is really important because it integrates over a long period of time and these idiosyncratic storm events that come across, but then you kind of have this reservoir of water sitting in mountains that melts at relatively predictable times. But increasingly what this is saying, and by 2020, it already happened. Sorry, this paper was published in 2022, so it hadn't happened yet. Now we're past the time of emergence in terms of the fraction of winter melt that happens before peak SWE, which is just to say that snow melt's happening both earlier and it's happening, a greater fraction of it's happening kind of before that big spring melt. Okay, but some people care about snowpack because it's fun to play on. Other people care about snowpack because it provides runoff, and that runoff is really, really important. And the reason we have all these SNOTEL measurements is because they add by measuring snow throughout the winter, water managers have a pretty good idea of what's coming downstream. So there's a reason that we have watering restrictions across the Denver-Boulder area, because they already know the snowpack is low and we're not going to have those resources. It doesn't rain much in Colorado in the summer. Okay, so same plot on the top, the change in ensemble mean SWE, and then on the bottom, the change in mean runoff. And the picture here looks even worse in the sense that you can kind of see this peak, the peak runoff. So if you're a boater and you like playing on the water, your peak flows are coming down, and then they're also shifting earlier. This is all model space. And so I wanted to look at 3 more metrics to try to look at some of the internal variability, both of peak flows and then the center timing, which is basically, if you look at the whole hydrograph, like how much runoff did we get this year, what's the date when half of the water came off, so what's the date when the glass was half full, and then total runoff just integrating under this curve. How much water are we getting? So from this grid cell, again, top plot for max SWE is the same, but now bottom right, peak runoff is happening earlier. That's not surprising given this graph. But the time of emergence, based on the internal variability of the model, is much later. So we'll see a decline, the prediction from the model is you see a decline in max SWE sooner than you see a change in the peak runoff, which is, to me, I guess, kind of interesting. But it just, if you're looking for leading predictors, max SWE is a better predictor than peak runoff in this case. And then now focusing on the water side, peak runoff and max and kind of the mean state on the top, and then on the bottom, the change in center timing, and then the change in total runoff. So even though this looks really bleak in terms of total runoff, over the year it's actually the same. It's just that it's happening earlier. So the water yields from this grid cell in CESM don't show a change in total runoff, and that's mostly because the model's getting a lot more precipitation. But less of it is as snow. So we're getting more precipitation, less of it is snow, and more of it's because there's less snow around, it's melting earlier. And it's the center timing, or the time when half the flows come across is quite a bit earlier, and it gets early fast. So we're, according to this analysis, we're 15 years past this shift, this change in center timing. Okay, so I kind of alluded to this already. People get to ski and snowshoe and play a lot in the winter, and their jobs is to go measure the snowpack. Sounds like a pretty good gig. But again, that's mostly done because measuring snow, we think, gives us some predictability in terms of runoff, and you can kind of guess where this is going. So if you look at the baseline period, which I think here was roughly 1980 through 2000, I can't remember for sure, but there's this really tight correlation with, if you know max SWE, if you know how much snow is sitting on the ground in April, more or less like now, you have a really good idea of how much runoff you're going to get. So this is 40 ensemble numbers, I think 20 or 30 years of data, and each line, each thin line is a single ensemble number. So across ensemble numbers, there's this really tight predictability between being able to predict total runoff, total end of water year runoff from max SWE. So it basically means you can go out and measure snow in April, and you know how much water you're going to get out of that watershed, both in the model and in reality. But then if you go through the end of the century, you can see that relationship totally breaks down. And so the total runoff actually is the same, but the peak SWE is shifted to the left. And any individual ensemble member, like this ensemble member, basically has zero predictability. And some of them still have relatively strong predictability, but the ensemble mean has a much lower correlation coefficient and a weaker slope. So that's just to say that snow in the future, according to CESM, is going to be a much weaker predictor of runoff, which presents a whole lot of challenges for places that are used to depending on this. So kind of in summary, we can see that max SWE is lower, snow-free days are longer, the number of snow-free days are longer, there's a higher fraction of winter snowmelt, with lower peak flows, earlier center timing, but no change in runoff. But I think the most important part of the study was this predictability piece, and it really highlights the importance of being able to use large ensembles in a more of a predictive framework to see how these historical correlations really break down in the future. It's a bit of a cautionary tale, but I use these when I think I should keep working, and I look at this figure, it's like, oh, I should really go skiing. You can work in 2050, but you're not going to be able to ski for much longer. No. Hopefully that's not true, but after this year, I'm not so sure. Okay, so switching gears, this is going to be kind of lightning fast, but I wanted to talk some about potential vegetation responses to climate change. And in particular, this is work that Katya J. led. She was a postdoc working with me and others at the Niwot Ridge LTER. And she had this question of how may biota amplify or dampen ecosystem responses to climate change. And kind of a nice conceptual model, which is to say that over time, here, if you look at some sort of ecosystem metrics, so here ecosystem productivity or GPP, you might have ecosystem responses that track the climate change. So they track one of these climate change scenarios, either in red or in blue, or they might lag it. And so a lag response would just be to say that the ecosystem doesn't respond as fast as the climate does, which could be real, or it could track really closely. So the things that could make an ecosystem track or lag would be a phase shift in something. So with climate change, if we have earlier snow melt, then are the plants able to respond with their phenology, so a phase shift towards earlier phenology? Or if you have a longer growing season, do you see some sort of amplification in GPP where maybe the plants are kind of hardwired to green up or senesce at a certain time, but because it's warmer, they're able to grow taller or grow more. And then you also might have a phase shift in amplification interaction. So this is kind of the theoretical framework that Katya was putting this work in. I wanted to talk about it here because it's kind of a nice way of talking about ecosystem studies with CLM, so you can do these global scale runs but you can also really drill in and focus on an ecosystem, and I think that's kind of one of the cool features of working with a land model like CLM. So how do you do that? It's kind of just depends on how you define your box. So if you're running a global model, we have surface data sets that define each box in terms of the plants that are there, what the soils look like, whether you're running it coupled to the atmosphere or with the data atmosphere. But you can just as easily take one of those boxes and put your own ecosystem inside of it. So that's what Katya did at Iowa. A lot of this is work that some folks in the room are already using. And so we had this collaboration a couple years ago with NEON to make this even easier to use. And so we took NEON data, which is kind of providing the forcing for the atmospheric state of the box. And then also some NEON measurements that went into characterizing the vegetation and the soils that were in each of these ecosystems. And then because NEON has any flux towers, we have observed fluxes that we can compare the simulated fluxes to. And we have all of this sort of in a Dockerized container with some helpful scripts to both run the model and look at the output. So Katya didn't use this system, but it's work like Katya's that kind of inspired us to develop this system to make these tools easier to use. So what Katya did was working at the Niwot Ridge LTER, which has the second longest continuous CO2 record. We also have the longest high elevation temperature and preset measurements. And just this wealth of data. So there's all kinds of interesting data to run with. And this is a place called the Saddle where a lot of the vegetation work is taking place. And it's kind of simplified into this, it's not snow covered now, but this is a picture, this tells you how bad the snow year was. This picture is taken from July 1st or 2nd. And so on a normal snow year, this moist meadow is still snow covered. It's totally bare. Like I was hiking up here a couple weeks ago, and there's no snow anywhere on that hillside. It's awful. It's really, really scary. Okay, so this snow-covered moist meadow, winds come from the west and blow snow over this knoll, and it accumulates on this moist meadow, which in the cartoon has kind of a big pillow of snow on it. The east-facing hill that the picture is taken from kind of comes up this way, and it's all wind-scoured, and the snow from the windward side gets blown up and over that ridge onto the one behind it. And they support different vegetation communities. So there's a dry meadow community on the windward slopes and a moist meadow community on the leeward slopes. And then in the middle, there's a wet meadow community. So these are all different kind of characteristic vegetation types for the site. And what we wanted to use was this new hill slope hydrology model that's used that we have for CLM that hydrologically connects these grid cells together. So these are independent columns. They all see more or less the same atmosphere, but in this case we don't have this sense of wind redistribution of snow, and so we changed the precip that each of the columns sees to kind of match what actually falls on those points. And the moist and wet meadow have what we think of as more resource acquisitive plants. I'll talk more about that in a minute, whereas the dry meadow has these conservative growth strategies. Okay, tons of data. There's precip meteorology, incoming solar radiation and soil properties that are all measured at the site. There's a whole bunch of other data that have been collected on foliar traits, phenological traits, and plant hydraulic traits that we can use in the model to characterize the vegetation differently. And then there's even other data that we can use to evaluate. So there's snow depth, soil temperature, soil moisture, and productivity. There's just this wealth of data from working at a long-term research site like this that makes it, it's fun to play around with, but it's also really challenging because all of a sudden there's all this data that we have to try to integrate. It's a lot of data carpentry work. And so the first thing that Katya wanted to do was we have this idea of plant functional types in the model, which is to say that a grass is different than a tree, and an evergreen tree is different than a deciduous tree, and deciduous trees are different in boreal and temperate regions. And so in the model, we just have a generic C3 grass, but she kind of co-opted that to define these different communities from the moist, wet, and dry meadows. And she defined those based on measurements that are taken at the site. So this is specific leaf area. And so you can see that the dry meadow has kind of thick, tougher leaves that are characteristic of being in a more xeric environment, whereas the wet meadow is sitting in water all the time and it has nice thin kind of paper to use. Okay, so she took observations of a whole bunch of leaf traits, so specific leaf area, leaf carbon to nitrogen ratios, and delta C13. Delta C13 isn't something that we use in the model, although we do have isotopes in the model. Instead, we use this to calibrate some of the plant hydraulic traits that are characteristic of kind of more water conservative versus more water acquisitive traits. And then she also used phenocams. Anyone who's worked at flux towers, most flux towers have phenocams, which are just these cameras that are pointed at different points in the landscape, and you can use the greenness, the fraction, it's basically an index of greenness that's taken from the camera, and over the course of the year define like the start of the growing season, the peak of the growing season, and then the end of the growing season. And so she was able to calibrate the kind of the environmental triggers, especially for the start of the season and then the rate of change to get to the peak of the season for these 3 different communities. You can spend a ton of time calibrating a model like this for site level stuff. And ultimately it kind of matters, like, all right, is your model adequate for purpose? Like at some point you need to choose what your target is and just decide like, all right, this is good enough. And so Katya did this kind of by looking at a few characteristics. I'm going to walk through this graph carefully and then kind of move a little bit more quickly. So this has 3 different y-axes to make things really confusing, and then day of year, starting January 1st on the x-axis. So snow depth, this is where the wet meadow gets about a meter of snow on it, and then as the snow melts, the greenness, this is observations in green, the greenness kicks off. And one of the things that you'll notice is that according to the phenocams, it starts getting green before the snow is actually gone, but we realize that the phenocams actually are measuring more of a south aspect of this landscape, and then the snow depth that we calibrated this to has a little bit more of a north aspect. And so we're kind of okay with this fudginess of plants greening up before the snow melts. That doesn't happen in reality, but it's happening here because of these aspect differences that we're not really accounting for. And then in the brown line is gross primary productivity. And so that's GPP, that's how much carbon is coming into the ecosystem. And the units of GPP and greenness don't totally make sense, or the magnitude doesn't really make sense, but it's the timing that's more important. So here you can see that in the model, GPP actually does kick up as snow is melting, and then it goes out through the summer and then stops in the fall. Okay, that's just for the wet meadow, but we have moist meadow, wet meadow, and dry meadow. Here the axes are all scaled the same. So you can see that the moist meadow has more snow. Good, like sanity check, that's what we wanted. The wet meadow has the highest productivity, and also has the latest, I'm sorry, not the latest. The moist meadow has the latest start of the growing season. The dry meadow has the earliest start of the growing season, and productivity, snowpack productivity and greenness are all lower in the dry meadow. So kind of sanity check, like, all right, this is representing ecosystems that sort of look like what we're trying to represent in Iowa Ridge. But then what we really wanted to look at was how, again, going back to this tracking versus lagging, and looking at uncertainty. So is the uncertainty in climate change and the climate change signal kind of on par with or greater than the change in how plant traits might respond? And so this is starting to feel a little bit more like a classic ecology experiment. So now we've got 2 different scenarios, SSP 245 and SSP 370. Globally, these 2 scenarios have about 3 degrees of warming for the SSP 245 and about 4.5 degrees of warming for SSP 370. And we're able to run the model at a point scale forced with anomalies to kind of get us to the changes in climate that are seen for this site or that might be expected at this site. And then we're able to look at plant trait uncertainty by saying, okay, under these warming scenarios, we don't know whether the dry meadow will become more resource acquisitive or conservative. There's a bunch of observations showing that the communities are changing and the community weighted mean traits in those communities are changing, but the direction is very uncertain. You might imagine if you've got a longer growing season, it might be better to be more resource acquisitive because you can grow taller, grow faster, but that's probably only in resource-rich environments, so maybe like the wet meadow, whereas in the dry meadow, a longer growing season is going to help you because you don't have any water. So there, a more resource-conservative approach might be more advantageous. I can argue that the other way too, but I'm not going to have time to go into that right now. And so Katya ran just these historical runs, so this is roughly kind of averaged over the 2010s, and we're just looking at GPP. So again, you can see the dry meadow greens up earlier, the wet meadow greens up the most, and the moist meadow's got somewhere in between. And then she ran the two scenarios, so SSP 245 and 370 in blue and in red. And then the shading around these is to say what happens if you also have more resource acquisitive or more resource conservative traits. So the uncertainty in this, the scenario uncertainty is shown between the red and the blue lines, and the trait uncertainty is shown as the shading around those lines. And if you partition the uncertainty, this is just a two-way ANOVA now, and to say where is more of the uncertainty happening over time, so starting in 2020 and going through 2100, the colors show that there's more uncertainty in the traits, so there's more uncertainty around these lines than what's in gray on that far figure than there is between the lines, especially until about 2060. But and then after 2050, 2060, depending on if you're in a moist or a wet meadow, there the forcing uncertainty starts to really matter, and that's mostly because of the change in growing season length. So that the kind of amplitude here shows you more of the trait uncertainty, whereas the growing season length is what's really pushing the scenario of uncertainty out. But again, that doesn't really happen until much later in the scenario, and most so in the wet meadow, and really not at all in the dry meadow. So Katya didn't come up with these conclusions, but I did. I guess the first one she might have done. Trait uncertainty is large and likely underestimated. So this is kind of a big thing in the model. When we run the model, typically you run it with one value of traits for every PFT, and they're stuck with those traits forever. And really ignoring the direction and rate of biotic change to feedbacks is maybe at our peril. I think that the likelihood that plants would change in response to climate change is high, but we don't really have a good sense of how they may change or how we can include those in our model other than this kind of ad hoc approach that we took right now. Okay, those are Katya's conclusions. My conclusions are a little bit more broad, and it's like, this is like a landscape that we are never supposed to represent. In a global scale model, alpine tundra does not show up on any of our grid cells, but you can still put this ecosystem in a CLM box and get pretty reasonable results, which I think is exciting. So you can configure CLM for a whole bunch of novel applications, which I think is exciting. It's really fun to work with diverse long-term data products. It's, like I said, a lot of data carpentry to try to get the workflows put together to ingest all of these different data types into the model. And the best part is getting to work with different interdisciplinary teams. So if people on this that work with snow, and they work with plant traits, and they work with there's just a data person who's on the team. Anyway, but it's fun to bring all these different perspectives into the workflow. So I want to conclude with, I guess, just by saying that the challenges that we face are complex. Like it's not any surprise, and many of us are in the room because we're interested in understanding these challenges, and many of them are inherently interdisciplinary because the system that we're trying to represent is obviously interconnected. So changes on the atmosphere have feedbacks on both the ocean and the land, and then changes in any of these components really do have feedbacks on the others. And so to accomplish, to address these complex challenges, we really need integrative tools, and we really have to have collaborative science. And so kind of towards that end, I'd encourage any of you, it sounds like there already is there's several of you who are thinking about coming to NCAR, and I'd encourage you to kind of reach out. I think it is a really special place to get to work. And I was so impressed to hear oceans and soils in the same room at lunch today. That's most of our lunchtime conversations at NCAR. It's like, wait, what are you talking about? It's really interesting to learn from all these different disciplines. So with that, I'll leave it with a conclusion slide. This is a QR code that'll just take you to the CESM events page. It's a good place to find out when the next workshop is, when the next tutorial is. If you're not already signed up to be part of a working group, if you're interested in land, interested in ocean, there's kind of a working group for everyone. and your engagement is as much or as little as you want it to be. You can, I send out maybe quarterly emails to the land model working group, and you can ignore all of them if you want, but I also send out another mailing list that we have weekly meetings that you can come and join. Yeah, with that, I'll open it up for questions. Thanks.
Feel free to ask any questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, really interesting talk.
Thanks.
I really enjoyed it. I guess this is more of a technical question, but I'm curious about the snow measurements. Because you had mentioned blowing snow, and so I was wondering how those would impact the falling snow measurements, or if you've looked at like wind speed and correlation.
Snow is so hard.
Yeah.
So hard.
Yeah.
In the model, we don't blow snow around. The CES does. The CES does have a blowing snow representation.
Yeah.
I don't know how they do it.
I don't know either.
Are you talking about, or is your question more model focused? Or?
I guess it was just like like when you're taking the actual observations of the snow, like you look at wind speed and see like how that, and I guess at modeling perspective too, like didn't know if there was.
Yeah, I feel okay about the snow measurements that we have at NIWAT. There is this like ad hoc correction, so they have it like, a tipping bucket in the, I think it's called a Wyoming screen or something. That's like the best way you can measure snow in windy places. But like it's an insanely windy place. Like wind speeds over 100 miles an hour are not unheard of there. And so there's this ad hoc correction that we make because one of the old LTER directors spent a ton of time measuring this stuff. So you just like, whatever the gauge tells you, you turn it down 20% in the winter and believe the rain. It's very ad hoc.
Yeah.
It seems to make sense. It's the best. It's kind of the best we have. To me, the most interesting part is, so the dry meadow, which is, and this is, I didn't get to argue this point, but the dry meadow usually is wind scoured, except for in the spring. So like right now, like tomorrow or today, it should be snowing up there. And those spring snows are usually really wet, which means they stick around. And so the wet snow can't get, usually those are upslope storms, so it's supposed to come from the west, the storm's coming from the east. So the upslope storm has wet, warm snow, and then it sits there for a while. To me, it was really interesting, even though that site's at close to 12,000 feet, and it should be like powdery, dry snow. If with climate change predictions, we would expect to get wetter, heavier snows there, and so you might expect that the dry meadow, it would accumulate snow not just in these spring events, that it should get more snow, more permanent snowpack year round if it's wetter,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting. So that's the other like mind bender. It's like, the dry meadow's going to get wetter, the wet meadow's going to get drier. But they're almost, this is like, it's like meters scale, or even less, between those communities, and you can't measure snow everywhere. So we have like, one good gauge that we kind of trust. And it's supposed to capture everything. It's hard.
Yeah.
There has been some cool work. There's a measurement group at NCAR who Ethan Gutman developed this thing. It's like a laser scanner. It's basically like LiDAR turned horizontally and scanning for snow. And so he wasn't trying to measure snow. He wasn't trying to measure precipitation, but accumulation. And it kind of gave it, he only had it up there for like a year, but it does give you a sense of how snowpack evolves over time. Otherwise, we have to go out with a pole every 2 weeks to measure it. And people have done that for like 25 years. Thanks. Yeah.
With the loss of the snowpack, how are farmers adapting to
A lot of the farmers in eastern Colorado are pumping groundwater, so some of them are don't have to adapt yet. That's further east. That's mostly like Ogallala Aquifer stuff, closer into the mountains. There it is mostly irrigated. There is a lot of dryland wheat already, so that's usually not, it's snow fed. It's dryland winter wheat, so that some of them are not using irrigation. I'll be curious, there's just like around where I am, there's a lot of people historically have planted a lot of both sugar beet and corn, which are both kind of water hogs. And I'll be curious to see how much that changes. There is some interest in more barley and again more winter wheat. So like that's the biggest way people are adapting is by planting different crops. But it really depends on who has the water rights, and oftentimes the farmers have the oldest water rights, so they don't really have to change because water losses, they get the water. They're the last ones who have to give up their water. So yeah, that gets into politics, not science more. Yeah.
Alfalfa too.
Yeah.
Too much alfalfa, but
Yeah.
different conversation.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a question about the end of the first part of your talk when you were
Sure.
looking at the CESM and SWE.
Yeah.
And you had all those really pretty tightly coupled, that was historical
Oh, yeah.
simulations, and then it falls apart, right?
Yeah.
Is it falling apart? But you said the total amount of precipitation is not really changing, or maybe.
No, precipitation's going up. Yeah.
So is it just coming as rain and not snow?
Or it's melting. I'm not sure for this grid cell. See, either more of it's coming as rain, or more of it's coming as snow but melting before peak sweep.
Right, so because that's a peak SWE.
It's peak sweep,
Peak
not.
SWE relationship
Yeah.
there, yeah. Okay, so peak SWE is falling apart about a little bit, but,
Yeah, and I guess I didn't interrogate it that much to see how much of it is how much of the signal or loss of signal
right,
is because of a switch to rain versus, and it almost would be hard to decompose. Although one of the things the model doesn't do explicit, like when rain falls on snow in the model, it just goes right through it.
yeah.
It doesn't actually,
It doesn't.
make the snow nasty to ski on. It should, but we don't do that.
Right, so maybe just continuing on last year, so at some level, if you're the United States Bureau of Reclamation, your total inflow to need is maybe not appreciably changing.
Yeah, that would.
Lots of other factors are changing, but in aggregate, if your total precipitation amount is not appreciably changing.
That would be the prediction from CESM. There's a with a couple of huge caveats. One is
Right, that's
the
what.
model has a huge CO2, or there's a relatively, not huge, there's a reasonable CO2 fertilization effect. But in CESM2, it also has a large change in water use efficiency. So you have more CO2 in the atmosphere, your stomata don't have to open as much, and so you can actually have lower ET
Yeah.
with higher CO2 in ways that might or might not be. So that'd be one caveat, would be the change in water use efficiency, which would let more come in, like you could have the same ET fluxes and more coming out the bottom.
Right. Does it do anything with infiltration? Because that's also very different for rain and for snow, right? What will infiltrate the shallow groundwater?
Yeah, we don't have groundwater.
Yeah.
I think the other big thing that ILA has found is that we don't do a good job capturing observed humidity trends over regions like the desert Southwest. So if you believe Area 5, it's gotten much drier, like specific humidity, I'm gonna get these wrong. Somebody can help me. Specific humidity's gone down, but relative humidity stayed the same. Am I saying that right, or is it the other way around? Anyway, we're getting humidity trends wrong. And so the atmospheric water demand in CESM2 probably isn't high enough. So we have this compound problem of like increasing water use efficiency so the plants aren't releasing enough, but we're still somehow pumping enough water out of the land surface to match, it must just be ground evaporation, to not allow the atmosphere to be getting drier, as dry as it should be. If I was on the Bureau, I don't know if this model would be fit for purpose of predicting lake need levels. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, I really like that question. I had a related question about the predictability and that loss of predictability. And it sounds like maybe there's more work to be done. But you mentioned the fractional loss is predictive, and I wonder if over time that total value is getting less and less representative of like the net value, or that peak value is less and less representative of the net value.
Yes.
And that's the issue you're having, that like the net accumulation would still be predictive, but you just have to like keep track of what the net is, because if you're having more melting, then your peak value is going to be.
Yeah, so it would make those snow measurements that are hard to make even more important.
Yeah. So I guess maybe the question is like, what are people doing now in regards to snow, and like how are they making those? How do you go from the measurements that are being made now to the management decisions that are being made now? Do people just go out when they think it's peak, or do people measure it consistently, or with enough regularity that you would be able to try to get that fractional?
Yeah, so that's why the snow tell sites are so valuable, is
Yeah.
because it is continuous.
Mhm.
And they tend to be in like the snowiest places, like the dependably snowiest places, because it gives you the most robust signal. And so then it's just like a simple, my guess is it's just like a relatively simple correlative model to say, like, if we have half a meter of SWE, what's runoff going to be
Yeah.
out of this watershed? And you can integrate over some spatial domain. But, you know, so then you're integrating like, you know, a meter square
Mhm.
for the watershed,
Yeah.
kind of a thing. But that's better than sticking a pole in the ground
Yeah.
every April 1st.
Yeah.
But anyway, they do both of those. There is a bunch of work now with plane-based LiDAR to fly these areas to say,
Mhm.
like, you know, and then if you fly them, you know, fly them in the summer and then you fly them at peak SWE, you know the difference in elevation.
Yeah.
And you can guess how much snowpack is there. But translating that into water units is tricky because you don't know if that's like really wet snow or really dry snow,
Yeah.
basically. And that's where you, like, there's still no good substitute for it, like an old-fashioned pit and like doing the snow survey
Mhm.
stuff. But and anyway, the groups that are doing those plane-based LiDAR approaches, I think they're at least they're selling it in ways that this gives a better integration.
Yeah.
But if it's coming as rain, you're not going to measure it. Or if
Yeah.
it's melting during the winter, again, you're not measuring.
Yeah. My second question was, what are you, like, that total accumulation, is that at the same time, like the same day, like July 1st or something? Your total runoff value, is it the same no matter whether the snow's melting earlier, historically?
So are you asking in the model?
Yeah, in the model, because you were showing the relationship between peak SWE and total runoff. So
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
where's that?
Oh, it's for the water year.
Yeah,
So it's
okay.
assuming that the water year starts
So
on
it's the
October
whole
1st.
year. My other thought was whether or not it's still a good predictor, like, given the same number of days after the melts, like, it finishes melting, and then because that time frame is longer, you get less predictability, just because there's more time where there's no snow at all, and that peak SWE is earlier, and then just because of that time.
Yeah, one of the things, so Keith Musselman is on that paper, and one of the things that he's said is that, I'm not a hydrologist, so I'm gonna get this wrong, but like basically, snow melt acts like kind of like a piston, and like the more snow you have melting quickly, the faster it goes. And so if you have like so basically what they're seeing is slower runoff, even though it's starting earlier. So if all of your water is melting at once, it just gets like forced through the soil and then out the bottom. Whereas if it melts slowly, then it has more time to infiltrate and hang around, I guess. So like earlier snowpack doesn't actually mean more yield out the bottom. You actually get higher yields when it melts fast.
Mhm. But
I don't know if that answers your question.
Is that infiltration isn't in the land model though, you said?
Well, there is infiltration, but I don't know how much of the bulk, I don't know how reasonably we handle the bulk flow.
Yeah.
That'd be a good question.
Yeah.
I guess we probably don't do as good a job, but the hill slope model does a lot better. Like the stuff that Sean has done with the hill slope. I actually have one thought to show, and then I think we probably have to get out of here. I had like 4 talks I wanted to give. Do I have it? Okay, so this is a single grid cell. Oh, wait. So this is basically an Ameriflex tower mapped onto hill slopes and then over kind of a several kilometer scale difference. And so you can, green is when the snow is gone and white is when there's lots of snow. And so with the hill slope model, you can kind of see that it's hard to, if you don't know this landscape, it doesn't mean anything, but this is Niwot Ridge. And then the north-facing slopes hold snow longer than the south-facing slopes, and then the lower areas melt out first. So you can kind of see these dynamics. And this is just like a really quick, dirty thing that I did. But he's doing this now, like over the Alps, with machine learning to map from these column levels up to like this really high-resolution map. And the maps that he's getting are as good as like a kilometer scale model that the Swiss team is running. for these like high scale, high resolution runoff predictions. So I think there are ways that you can configure the model to get like meaningful results. But then, you know, we have SNOTEL observations for all these sites, and it's like, well, you know, one atmospheric driver, and then partition it on the hill slope model, you can actually capture things that kind of make sense. Which to me is really exciting. I think that's the kind of stuff we got to be doing more of.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Let's thank Will for a great talk.